I want you to hit me as hard as you can.
Hollywood has had its fair share of disasters, but one film is widely regarded the benchmark of costly mistakes. Thanks to the rise of early 90s internet and its resulting rumor mill, many would have you believe that Waterworld was one of the most expensive fiascos in film history. But was it really? Waterworld is legendary for its pricey off-screen insanity, and the final product is something from an era long past. Let's take a look back at what's considered the blunder of Hollywood excess to figure out what the f*** happened to this movie. For a movie as historically expensive as Waterworld, it's awfully ironic that it actually began as a bargain bin Roger Corman B-movie. In 1986, Hollywood was still churning out ripoffs of George Miller's action classic, Mad Max 2, aka The Road Warrior. And Corman's New Horizon Pictures was looking to produce their own for only $3 million. Writer Peter Ratter was tasked with coming up with an original take on the post-apocalyptic trope. He pitched them Mad Max on water. After the polar ice caps had all melted, Earth became one giant ocean, leaving humanity as drifters on their man-made islands. Ratter was rejected instantly, as New Horizon predicted that a film set entirely on water would cost at least $5 million, clearly out of their range. Ratter wrote it anyway. Unrestrained by budget, he penned a huge, colorful epic about a no-named loner that sails between floating colonies on an endless ocean. The mariner traveled in an enormous river barge, where he secretly kept a white horse, for whatever reason. Birds were of high value, as they could detect dry land, and the villain called himself Neptune, wielding a trident and sitting on a clamshell throne. Ratter sat on the script for a couple of years before polishing it up and selling it as a spec. The script ended up in the hands of producers Andy Leicht and Jeff Muller in 1988. They had just produced their first film, the Corey Haim-Corey Feldman comedy License to Drive. It was a mild hit, and the producers wanted to flex their muscles with something bigger. Looking at Waterworld, they discussed endlessly with Ratter about how they could feasibly and safely make the film on water and projected a budget of $30 million. They teamed up with producing brothers Larry and Chuck Gordon to make it happen. By 1992, Kevin Costner and director Kevin Reynolds were both independently interested in making Waterworld, but refused to work with each other. The Kevins became friends after Costner was cast in Reynolds' first feature, Fandango. Years later, while Costner was directing Dances with Wolves, he had Reynolds on set as an advisor. They collaborated again on Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, but their friendship fractured after multiple on-set fights over numerous issues, including Costner's insistence on attempting an English accent.
They got armor, Paul? Even this boy can be taught to find the chinks in every suit of armor.
During the edit, Costner grew annoyed over the amount of Alan Rickman's screen time as the villain.
Do you mind, Loxley?
So the fed-up Reynolds left the picture, leaving Costner to finish it, and their friendship over. When Waterworld came around, Larry Gordon thought the Kevins were the right men for the job. He convinced them to sit down together and bury the hatchet. Now on board, Universal Pictures officially bought the script, and the Kevins started making sweeping changes. First, screenwriter David Twohy, fresh off The Fugitive, was brought in for rewrites, replacing Ratter, who was already exhausted with the project after years of writing dozens of drafts. Most of the whimsical elements were stripped from the story, grounding it in a more dirty Western style. No horse or birds, and Neptune was toned down to a one-eyed villain. Gills were added to the mariner, and he became more of a recluse who wasn't interested in the search for dry land. As the budget increased to $65 million, Leicht and Muller felt their concerns for shooting on water were being ignored. But when they spoke up, Universal forced them to leave the film. While they managed to maintain their executive producing credits, they now believe Waterworld's insane production was a bullet worth dodging. They moved on to make Ben Stiller's The Cable Guy.
Dry land is not a myth! I've seen it! Kevin Costner, Waterworld!
When the start date drew closer, the Kevins' differences boiled back up. Reynolds wanted to make an action film that would rival anything made in the last decade. Costner wanted a more meaningful character piece that focused on his hero. Their disagreement led to an unfinished script only days before filming. A last-ditch effort by Costner was to hire the script doctor from Speed, one Joss Whedon, who would be on the set to punch up the dialogue. The filmmakers decided to shoot on the north end of the big island of Hawaii, called Kauai Ha'e. Since the location was relatively remote, local contractors knew they were the only option for Universal. They nickel and dimed the production, driving up the cost on everything, from materials to transportation. The priciest set by far was the floating atoll, made of wood, steel, and paper mache, which was budgeted at $1 million, but jumped to $5 million by completion. By the time filming actually begun, Waterworld's budget had ballooned to $100 million. Before Reynolds began shooting, he asked Steven Spielberg if he should shoot a film on water, since Jaws was notoriously difficult to make. He replied, "You might. I'll never do it again." So the day before the June 1994 start date, the cast and crew attended a blessing of the site by a kahuna high priest as an attempt to cast a good omen upon production. Little did they know that Kauai Ha'e translates to warring waters, and nothing was going to calm that ocean. Filming on Waterworld was bonkers. Reynolds said in his own words, production wasn't a 3-ring circus, it was a 12-ring circus. The cast and crew constantly got seasick. Mountains and shipping vessels in the background would spoil shots that would later need to be digitally removed. Cloud cover caused inconsistencies in a single scene. They stopped entirely for any rain. And the wind and waves would ruin starting positions for all boats involved, mostly the ones the cameras were on. There were frequent firings and crew walkouts, as high up as special effects supervisors and the assistant director. Getting hundreds of people to a set 1,000 yards offshore took hours, and they would break for lunch as soon as they all got there. But if they didn't get fed, Universal had to pay union fines upwards of $2 million.
We ate 2 days ago.
You ate.
And don't even think about the amount of sewage that had to be pumped out of the toilets hidden within the sets. If things weren't just gross or troublesome, they became dangerous. One local stuntman would commute 40 miles by water and got lost at sea for a full day before being rescued. During a chase sequence, stars Jean Triplehorn and Tina Majorino were on the front of the Mariner's signature trimaran when the cable snapped, dropping them into the water and nearly being run over by the very boat they were just on. Jellyfish were so rampant that Costner started calling Majorino jellyfish candy because she was stung so many times. Costner wasn't immune to the troubles, though. To get one aerial shot, he was tethered to the top of the trimaran for 2 hours. The mast would sway back and forth, putting Costner closer and closer to the blades of the helicopter. Then the wind picked up, and the boat sped away from the safety crew. It took them a half hour to catch up and rescue their star.
If you'll notice the arterial nature of the blood coming from the hole in my head, you can assume that we're all having a real lousy day.
The worst was Costner's stunt double, who shot a deep dive sequence only to surface too quickly and nearly died from an embolism caused by decompression sickness. All these issues aside, as a film, Waterworld's biggest problems stemmed from an incomplete script and the creative differences between Reynolds and Costner. According to production designer Dennis Gassner, Costner wanted to do a heroic Errol Flynn type movie, but Reynolds wanted a less passionate character. This led to a performance awkwardly stuck between the two.
If I let you out of here, you're taking us with you.
Sure.
The Kevins returned to their petty squabbling until Costner announced mid-production that he was getting divorced from his wife of 16 years. Reynolds, who previously went through his own divorce, sympathized with Costner. They once again shelved their disagreements to finish the film. But if things weren't bad enough, the prolonged shoot pushed production into hurricane season, and sure enough, a giant storm tore through the atoll, sinking the $5 million set. What couldn't be salvaged from the ocean floor had to be rebuilt.
Sit back.
At this point, Universal grew tired of the constant headaches and wanted script cuts. Costner was still passionate that Waterworld could work as is, and asked Universal to trust him and the changes being made by Whedon. To appease their financial worries, he waived his 15% cut of the film's gross. Don't worry, he still got paid his original $12.5 million. Yet Whedon, years removed, said none of his suggestions were ever used, and the lines he did improve were were delivered so poorly that he can barely watch the film now.
For a hideous freak, you're okay. It was a joke.
He was hired for 1 week, but stayed for another 6 in what he called 7 weeks in hell. Production in Hawaii came to a merciful end at the beginning of 1995.
Oh, thank God.
The remaining scenes were filmed in LA in giant water tanks to finish interiors and effect shots. All in all, Waterworld went from its planned 96-day shoot to a grueling 166 days. Universal wanted to release the film that coming summer. They slashed Reynolds' editing time from 10 weeks to 5. The studio demanded that the film come in at 2 hours and 15 minutes, but Reynolds' first cut was 2:40. His suggested changes to get the running time down included reshoots. Obviously, Universal wasn't eager to return to the warring waters, and the delay would make them miss the summer release date. Costner was also worried that the cuts would force the film to be wall-to-wall action. His chief concern was his character. For Reynolds, it was the story. Their truce began to break.
You're pretty stingy for a man who's got everything, aren't you, then?
Reynolds agreed to let Costner and Chuck Gordon have a day in the edit room, as long as Universal allowed him to cut his own version for the Directors Guild. But a day turned into a week, and the studio said there wouldn't be time for Reynolds' DGA cut. It was the final straw for Reynolds, and history repeated itself. He left the picture. Costner argued that he went to bat for Reynolds throughout production and received no thanks for his sacrifices. Reynolds simply replied that in the future, Costner should only appear in pictures he directs himself. That way he can always be working with his favorite actor and his favorite director. Harsh. Though the Kevins seem to have made up over the years as they came together for the miniseries Hatfields and McCoys in 2012. An interesting side note, there are multiple versions of Waterworld, aside from the 2-hour, 15-minute theatrical cut. When it airs on TV, it has roughly 30 to 40 minutes put back in, depending on the channel, but censored for content. These versions include the removed Mount Everest shot, which was the scene that sold Reynolds on the screenplay from the beginning. A 3-hour fan edit also surfaced in the summer of 2008, called the Ulysses Cut, which included every known deleted scene compiled into an HD uncensored cut and was widely shared on the internet. And lastly, that November, Universal released the 2-disc extended edition, which is nearly identical to the Ulysses Cut. The lead up to Waterworld's release was plagued with nothing but bad press. Journalists had been writing about all the problems for months, almost enjoying spreading the gossip. They started calling the film Fishtar and Kevin's Gate, after the infamous bombs Ishtar and the studio crushing Heaven's Gate. Waterworld's final budget topped at a whopping $175 million, easily becoming the most expensive movie ever made, blowing past the previous record holder, James Cameron's $115 million spy comedy, True Lies. It became the straw man to how Hollywood was letting budgets get out of control. So by the time it released on July 28, 1995, audiences had already heard so many discouraging stories, it led to a modest opening weekend of $21 million and so-so reviews.
That makes you even more angry that perhaps there might be some people that won't ever get to see this movie based on what some idiot said.
While it is a big, bombastic, entertaining action flick, the pulling of two different creative forces can be felt, and plot holes abound. And even 14 years from Road Warrior, it does seem like a carbon copy, which, to be fair, was the intent, and they share the same director of photography. It finished its domestic run with $88 million, and this is why so many remember Waterworld as one of the biggest flops of all time. But there's more to it than that. Regardless of its quality, Waterworld's legacy marks a significant change within the industry. What Spielberg proved in 1993 with Jurassic Park was that CG was the future, and by 1999, George Lucas showed that entire movies could be made in a computer. Waterworld would end up being one of the last films of its kind. A massive epic, filmed practically, with huge sets and dangerous stunts that shows every multi-million dollar on the screen. The type of movie that would never be made today. It also represents the shift studios made toward relying on the global box office to make up for lackluster domestic showings. Because as much as Waterworld's reputation has most believing it failed, in reality, its worldwide gross of $264 million was decent. And when it hit home video, it turned a good profit. But as they say, when the legend becomes fact, print the legend. It's more fun to think of Waterworld as an expensive failure than a moderate success.
I don't know what all the fuss is about. I saw that movie 6 times. It rules!